So good afternoon, everyone. We are very happy that you're all back. This is day 2 of our clear writing workshop, and we are very much looking forward to welcome our first 2 speakers for today, Benjamin Grimshaw and Thomas Williams from the European Parliament. Let me just introduce our 2 speakers first. Ben Grimshaw studied modern languages at the University of Manchester and translation at the University of Westminster. He has been involved in translation work for international organizations and the private sector for about 10 years. Tom Williams studied modern languages at the University of Leeds and translation at the New University of Lisbon. He has worked in translation in the public and private sectors for around a decade. Ben and Tom work both in the English language team of the Directorate for Citizens' Language of the European Parliament's Translation Service. Their day-to-day work involves putting Parliament's clear language strategy into action by editing and translating documents, producing subtitles, and working on podcasts targeted at the general public in the EU. Their goal is to use clear, accessible language to make sure people know what the European Parliament does for them and how they can get involved in its work. It's wonderful to have the 2 of you here with your topic, clear language in text, audio, and video, reaching EU citizens. And to the audience, if you have any questions during the presentation, please write them in the chat and we will collect them again. And now, Ben and Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Manuela. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Grimshaw, and I'm here with my colleague, Tom Williams. As Manuela mentioned, we're intercultural and language professionals from the Directorate General for Translation at the European Parliament. Just like to say thanks to Annika and Manuela for inviting us and organizing everything today. The title of our presentation is Clear Language in Text, Audio and Video, Reaching EU Citizens. And Tom's now going to take us through the main points of today's presentation.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So just to give you a quick breakdown of what's going to be included in our presentation today, we'll start with talking about the European Parliament itself, and then the translation service, the Directorate General for Translation, where we work. Then we'll talk about citizens' language and the role it plays here at Parliament. And we'll go into a bit more detail about the different kinds of projects that we work on. After that, we'll give some tips and show you some real examples of texts and different projects that we work on here. After that, we planned a short practical exercise for you to do, which will be quite straightforward. We'll explain more about that later, just to be editing a short text to make it clearer. Afterwards, we'll come back and discuss that activity, and at the very end, we'll have a few minutes for questions. So yes, as Manuela said, if you have any questions while we're speaking, please put them in the chat and we'll come back to them at the end. So first of all, I'd like to share a short video which will give you an idea of our mission here at Parliament and what we want to do with clear language. So bear with me a moment while I share it. Hopefully you can now see it.
Do you know what the multi-annual financial framework is? The multi-annual financial framework. What do you think of the Spitzenkandidat? And what about the principle of subsidiarity? So, do you think clear language is important? Day after day, we read and listen to language that is not clear. Sentences can be long, repetitive, and full of jargon that only experts understand. Writers and speakers at the European Parliament know very well that using clear language brings their content closer to citizens, you and me, and allows us to find the information we need, understand it, and use it. Parliament's language professionals rightly celebrate International Plain Language Day. Our linguistic standards are second to none, and our commitment to seeing clear language gain prominence has gone beyond text to include audio and video, and in all 24 languages of the European Union. One thing is clear: the European Parliament works in your language, citizens' language.
Okay, thank you very much. And now Ben will start talking us through the European Parliament.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So what is the European Parliament and what does it do? It works for all of us living in the EU, and it's the only EU institution that we as EU citizens elect directly. We get the chance to do this every 5 years. It's composed of 705 members hailing from all 27 EU countries. It has 3 places of work: Strasbourg, which is where plenary sessions with all MEPs take place at 12 times a year; Brussels, which is where committee meetings take place; and Luxembourg, which is the home of Parliament's administrative services. Together with the Council of the EU, which is formed of ministers from all EU countries, Parliament makes decisions on laws that will apply across the EU. For example, there are new rules in the pipeline that mean all mobile phones and portable electronic devices will use the same type of charger from 2024. And in the photo, we can see the inside of Parliament's debating chamber. We work at the Directorate General for Translation, and as you can imagine, multilingualism plays a key role at Parliament. There are 27 EU member states and 24 official EU languages. Of course, there are fewer languages than members, as some languages like German are spoken in several member states. And having those 24 official languages means a record 552 possible language combinations. In light of the situation in Ukraine, Parliament has also created a Ukrainian language team so that some of our communication products are available to Ukrainian speakers. These products are shared on a dedicated website that was set up as part of an agreement between the European Parliament and the Ukrainian Parliament. Of course, MEPs have the right to speak and work in their language, and EU citizens have the right to access information and address all EU institutions in their language too. DG Trad employs roughly 1,200 members of staff, of which 850 are language professionals. Most of us are based in Luxembourg, but there are a few based in Brussels. DG Trad works on a wide range of projects, ranging from text that will eventually pass into law, such as regulations, to communications with the public. So what is citizens' language? In 2020, a decision was made at the highest level of Parliament's management to introduce a new clear language policy. The aim of this policy is to make Parliament's text accessible and understandable, and to take account of how people consume information nowadays. When we say accessible, we don't only mean making information accessible to visually impaired people through podcasts, or to deaf or hard of hearing people through subtitled videos, for example. We also mean reaching everyone on channels they use on a day-to-day basis. And this involves addressing people using the language they actually speak. Not just the language of their home country, but using the words that you or I might use when explaining things to a family member or friend. By doing this, we can get closer to citizens and bridge the perceived gap between the general public and the institutions that represent them. Let's not forget that having proper access to information is an essential part of democracy. If people know what impact the EU has on their lives, they're also more likely to engage with the institutions and vote in European elections. Finally, it's all about having all 24 languages available in 3 formats: text, audio, and video. And in a game-changing decision, a new directorate was set up to spearhead this drive towards clear language, to offer new kinds of language services to work in these three formats. That directorate is where we work, the Directorate for Citizens Language, offering new services in subtitling, audio, and even more. As a result, a new profile has been created to reflect the wider range of services offered, which is why we're known as intercultural and language professionals. The European Parliament is also represented on the Plain Language Working Group of the ISO Technical Committee on Language and Terminology Standards, which is currently working on a plain language standard. We see Cheryl touches on this in her presentation too. So we'll now have a look at what we do. But before we look at the formats in more detail, we should mention that we also have a team developing technology that converts speech to text, and then machine translates the text into other languages, specifically for the needs of the deaf and hard of hearing community wanting to access parliamentary debates. DG Trad's drive to achieve accessibility and clear communication with citizens involves several strategies. Today, we'll focus on what our teams of language professionals work on, translating, editing, and localizing products in three formats: text, audio, and video. What we mean by editing and localizing in our work is editing as in checking for language problems, clear language editing to make a text more suitable for its intended audience, and localizing as in making text more culturally relevant. For example, in a piece on EU protected designation of origin, we might mention balsamic vinegar of Modena in an Italian version, but champagne in a French version. So it's all about finding something that the reader can easily identify with. So why do we do this? Why is it important to make information available in three formats? Having one message on different channels gives people choice, and it helps them stay up to date with current affairs in their desired format. It boosts accessibility. So if you're hard of hearing, for example, you can use subtitled videos. If you don't have time to read a news article, you can listen to it while you empty the dishwasher. Overall, by providing accessibility, we're helping to keep people informed and engaged, which means they're more likely to take part in the democratic process as well. Now let's have a closer look at text. We work on a wide range of text, but here are a few examples of the products that you can access. At the end of the presentation, we'll share the links as well. We have a website called What Europe Does For Me and the Citizens app. These were both set up by the Directorate General for Communication before the last European elections to tell people what the EU is doing on their behalf and show how important it is to vote. Both of these include text, images, and some audio files. The Together.eu platform has a newsletter aimed at young people. It allows them to get involved in EU activities online and where they live. So we really encourage you to sign up and get involved. Our work on the newsletter involves a live editing stage at the beginning, where it's initially drafted in English, and we work directly with the authors to tailor it to the audience and try to see translation issues for the other languages. The European Parliament also has its own research service that provides information on specific topics that integrate text and video. One stage of our work for some of these products involves checking the final version before publication, such as checking the final layout and how the text looks in the final format. And Tom's going to show us an example of this type of text.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I'll just share the website with you now. Hopefully you can all see this. So this is an example of one of the interactive websites that are produced by Parliament's Research Service. This one's about climate change, as you can see. So when we go onto the website, we can click on different things and find out information about what climate change is, what the EU is doing to combat it. You can see here we have a few different sections with some images and also some links to videos that go into more detail about some of these aspects. There's also a section with data, which once this is loaded I'll be able to show you. And we can look at different aspects involved in climate change, find out more about the different concepts, which is just loading now. Hopefully you can all see that. So for example, energy efficiency, we can see a short description of what energy efficiency is, or we can open this and find out more. And obviously all of these texts will be translated into every one of the official EU languages. After we've translated them and sent them back to our colleagues, we will see this layout before it's published to make sure that everything is in the right place. So here we have some data about energy efficiency across the European Union. We can also come down here and see the breakdown country by country. So that's an example of the kind of post-delivery check we might do after we deliver the translations to the colleagues who've been working on the project. So if you give me just a second, I'll go back to the main presentation. There we go.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Next, we're going to have a look at audio. We produce a whole host of audio products and take care of the entire process from drafting to editing, translating, and localizing, and even recording and preparing the files for broadcast. Scripts are usually written in English or French and edited in language suitable for an audio format, which we'll go into more detail about later. They're then translated and localized into other languages. Our aim throughout this process is to ensure the content is engaging and easy to follow. We've received specific training on writing for audio products and have guidelines to follow as well. We record our products in-house and we have studios in the building, and we receive voice training to ensure the final product is easy to follow. Those products include regular news programs such as News in Brief, which is a short 1 to 2 minute news program released every day in all 24 languages. We also have Weekly Review, which is a summary of news from Parliament that comes out at the end of each week. There are also several broadcast series, podcast series, which are known as Better Legislation. This one explores the impact of EU legislation in different areas of life. For example, there's an episode on the right to repair, which calls on manufacturers to produce products that we as consumers can have repaired and reuse. These are often adapted from papers produced by Parliament's Research Service, who also make the infographics that we just saw a moment ago. Other podcasts are produced for special events, such as International Plain Language Day, which takes place around 13th of October. We also have partnerships with local radio stations around the EU, such as Radio Edition in Austria, to air our products for free. So if you're involved in broadcasting at your university radio station and would like to include any of these programs, just let us know. You can hear everything we produce on our audio website, and we'll provide the link with the rest at the end of today's presentation. So now let's listen to an example of one of these programs. It's the German version of our News in Brief program, recorded by our colleague Bojana, who's a University of Heidelberg student currently on a traineeship at Parliament. And she's here with us today to say a few words.
Thanks, Ben. Hallo alle zusammen. Ich wechsle mal kurz ins Deutsche. Ich bin Bojana und ich bin eine Kollegin von Ben und Tom. Und gerade studiere ich an der Uni Heidelberg im Master Übersetzungswissenschaft. und habe mir ein Urlaubssemester genommen, um hier im Europäischen Parlament mein Praktikum zu absolvieren. Und genau, bin hier eben als Sprach- und Kulturmittlerin im deutschen Übersetzungsteam tätig, in dem Referat für bürgernahe Sprache, wo wir uns eben auch mit klarer Sprache beschäftigen. Und wie wir schon gehört haben, halt eben nicht nur in Textform, sondern halt auch in Audioformaten oder Videos. Und genau das, was wir uns gleich anhören werden, sind die Kurznachrichten, die ich hier in meinem Praktikum auch aufnehmen darf. Genau, die werden jeden Tag ausgestrahlt und das sind Themen, die eben für die EU wichtig sind. Und ganz viel davon ist natürlich im Moment die Lage mit Russland und der Ukraine. Und die Nachrichten, die wir uns anhören, die habe ich Ende Juni aufgenommen. Und genau, da werden wir gleich mal reinhören.
Kurznachrichten. Seit Russland in die Ukraine einmarschiert ist, steht die Öffentlichkeit stärker hinter der Europäischen Union. Das ist das Ergebnis der neuesten Eurobarometer-Umfrage, die diese Woche veröffentlicht wurde. Fast 2/3 der Befragten sind dafür, dass die Ukraine Mitgliedstaat der EU wird. Das ist der höchste Umfragewert seit 2007. Die Wirtschaftssanktionen der EU gegen Russland unterstützen 80% der Befragten. Aber mehr als die Hälfte von ihnen spürt bereits die grundlegenden Veränderungen, die der Krieg in der Ukraine mit sich bringt. 61% glauben, dass der Krieg auch Folgen für ihr Leben hat. Insgesamt wurden für die Umfrage mehr als 26.000 Unionsbürgerinnen und Bürger aus den 27 Mitgliedstaaten befragt.
Okay, thanks, Bojana. Our third format today is video. We provide subtitles for videos ranging from short excerpts of MEP speeches to feature-length films. The videos will be shown in different contexts, from social media platforms to cinemas. Again, accessibility is key, but here it means 3 different things. Subtitles for videos in a language you don't speak, subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing, and subtitles that let people watch in many different situations. For example, they might be sitting on the bus without headphones, or they might be worried about waking someone up. The most ambitious project we work on is the Lux Audience Award, which is a prize awarded by the European Parliament and the European Film Academy to recognise European cinema. The winner is chosen from a shortlist of 3 to 5 films by cinema goers and MEPs. We subtitle the entries into every official EU language, including several sets of bilingual subtitles such as English and Irish. The winning film, which this year was Bosnian film Quo Vadis Aida, is subtitled for the deaf and hard of hearing. This is quite rare for films and audiovisual content in a foreign language. Subtitles for the deaf and hard of hearing and intralingual subtitling are important to improve accessibility and also make videos easier to watch on social media platforms where people are often watching without audio. We also receive specific training on how to produce subtitles videos in foreign languages and in our own languages. Each language team has language-specific guidelines for subtitling. And if you'd like to have a look at what some subtitling guidelines look like, you can have a look at the BBC and Netflix versions, which both are publicly available for English. Next, we're going to watch one of our research services videos published on YouTube, where subtitles are available in all EU languages.
Yep, so I'll just share that and hopefully you can see that. So this is just a very short excerpt from an informational video made by the research service about reparability and making electronic products last longer. So it doesn't have sound, it's not supposed to. You can see the narrator is speaking English, and we start off with English subtitles. But this is actually published on YouTube, and on the YouTube interface, you can select any of the other 23 EU languages, and the subtitles will change automatically. So, for example, German, we can just watch the end of this excerpt with the German subtitles. I hope the quality is okay. It's not always the best over Zoom, but it should give you an idea anyway of what it looks like. Okay. So we'll now move on to some examples and tips from our work. I'll preface this by saying these are obviously not meant to be universal. These are just some techniques and tips that we try to bear in mind when we're working. We've also broken this down into the 3 different formats, although obviously a lot of these tips will apply to all 3. Starting off with text. You also see probably a lot of the villains that we saw in the Commission's video yesterday cropping up here again as well. So obviously the concepts are quite similar. Jargon, this is a big issue. I was going to say problem. It's a challenge for us in the EU institutions because there's a lot of EU jargon and it's quite easy to let that slip into text for the general public if you're not careful. So we have to watch out for it. If we can't avoid it, we should at least explain what it is so nobody's left wondering. Breaking up long sentences, if we have, that can also happen quite easily if we're talking about something quite complicated. Sentences end up going over several lines. So we can just break that up into quite straightforward, simple sentences, which is also part of the next point, not having clunky and complicated syntax. So again, this is similar to one of the things that Cheryl Stephens was explaining yesterday. We want it to be easy to process. Something that's quite important in English, at least, is trying to go for the active voice when it's possible to do so. It's not always possible to do so, of course. Sometimes it's better not to use the active voice if doing so could be seen as rude. So an example of that would be a company writing to a customer saying, "We've noticed you haven't paid your bill," is probably quite confrontational, whereas you might instead say, "We've noticed that the bill hasn't been paid." Okay, so we're not assigning blame straight away. Something very important in a multilingual environment like ours is false friends and interference from other languages. This can happen very easily also because often people are drafting text not in their first language. A classic example of this would be something like éventuel in French, which doesn't translate to eventual in English, but occasionally we see it used in that sense. This one obviously applies to pretty much everything, so beware of grammatical, spelling and punctuation mistakes. Obviously, this is particularly important when we're communicating with the public because a text that's full of mistakes is likely to call into question the credibility of the institution, so they might not believe what we're saying. The last point on our list is probably the most important, so put yourself in your reader's shoes. Again, this is similar to one of the aspects that Cheryl Stephens was talking about yesterday. We want to always imagine who we're aiming this text at and write for them. So think about what information they want and ensure that they can get that information easily from what we've written. So we have a couple of examples. This is taken from an email to a member of the public who submitted a petition to Parliament's Committee on Petitions. And this is a reply from the committee saying that their petition's been received. So we have this first version here. The committee began its consideration of your petition and decided to ask the European Commission to conduct a preliminary investigation of the various aspects of the issue. So we already have a couple of things that we could perhaps improve to make this clearer, highlighted in red. And we have a proposed version here. We've got rid of the third person, the committee, entirely, and instead use the first person. So the author is writing directly to the person who will receive this email, saying, "I have asked the European Commission to conduct a preliminary investigation of the issue." We've also lost various aspects from the first version, which is rather superfluous. We don't really need that. So there's no reason to include it. Another example.
Sorry, Tom. I can only see the video.
I think the screen is stuck for a while.
Maybe it's frozen. Sorry, it's supposed to be. stop sharing and try again. Sorry about that. Is that working? Yeah.
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 Excellent. Okay, sorry, I didn't realize, I don't know what went wrong there, but anyway. Sorry, I'll show you the last example again quickly, just so you can see now what I was talking about. Before we move on to another excerpt from the same email. Slightly longer one. I'm pleased to inform you that the Committee on Petitions examined your petition and declared it admissible in accordance with the rules of procedure of the European Parliament, insofar as the issue which you raised falls within the fields of activity of the European Union. So again, we have things that we can definitely improve here. First of all, perhaps by getting rid of rules of procedure. These are the rules that govern everything that Parliament does, basically. But is that really necessary for a member of the public? Do we really need to talk about that to a member of the public who's submitted a petition? It might just leave them feeling a bit confused, not knowing what that means. It just makes the whole text more distant. We've also got rid of this insofar as the issue which you've raised, which is rather clumsy, and simply replaced it with since the matter you raise falls within the European Union's fields of activity. And here we can see the whole thing in one go. I won't read through it all, but just you can see straight away that the first thing that jumps out at you is that it's much shorter after it's been edited. So it's a third shorter, really. And it has this more human touch. So it creates more of a direct link with the person who would receive it. Moving on now to audio. So again, similar principles apply obviously as to text in many ways. One of the things we try to do when we're preparing scripts is to be conversational when we can be. So this wouldn't really be suitable perhaps for a news item, but for a podcast, it would be. So again, trying to imagine we're talking to our mom, talking to a friend. We want to obviously engage listeners. We could do this in several ways. Perhaps by painting a picture in their heads. So rather than using complicated numbers, we might say, if we're talking about the height of something, or a number of Eiffel Towers stacked one on top of the other. This is interesting, also tying in with what Cheryl Stephens said yesterday about visuals. Obviously, in an audio format, we don't have that, that possibility, but it's a way of also creating an image in their minds. And finally, we want to be trustworthy, convincing, specific, and consistent. So by being trustworthy, we mean being concise and accurate and objective. Convincing by giving facts and adjusting the content to the target audience we want to reach. Being specific, so not having redundancies, not having a lot of superfluous information, and giving examples to back up the points that are being made. And then finally being consistent. So we want a good structure and a logical sequence throughout the whole piece. So this is an example of an audio script. This is a news item. And I'm going to first of all just read it out in its unedited form. The EU has recently made important advances to boost defence cooperation by implementing ambitious initiatives to provide more resources, stimulate efficiency, and facilitate cooperation. For example, structured cooperation currently operates on the basis of 47 collaborative projects. Moreover, in April, an agreement was reached by MEPs to fund the European Defence Fund with a budget of 7.9 billion euros. The fund was created in 2017. According to a Eurobarometer survey, 3 out of 4 European citizens are in favour of a common EU defence and security policy. So a lot of this is quite a mouthful. It's quite difficult to process this information in its current form. And we have a proposed edited version with some suggestions of things we think could make it easier for a listener to understand. Let's highlight those one by one. First of all, we can change the structure. So we can introduce the topic with this information about the Eurobarometer survey, because that tells us why this topic is important. Okay, it's important to EU citizens. That's why we're talking about it. We can make things use more everyday language. So perhaps instead of important advances, we can just say big steps forward. We can break up this rather complicated syntax here This is a rather clunky sentence, implementing ambitious initiatives to provide, and so on. Replace that with ambitious initiatives for more resources and improved efficiency. It's shorter, it's more concise, it's easier to process. We've lost on the basis of, when we're talking about this structured cooperation, and change it to in the form of, because that's what we're trying to say, that this cooperation is formed of these different projects. We've got rid of a passive form, which should really be an active form in this case. Also, we really want to know who has agreed. So we have that information first. MEPs agreed to assign the budget. It's much more straightforward. We've rounded off this number. So instead of 7.9 billion euros, we just have almost 8 billion euros. The idea is the same. We have an idea of how much money is involved, but we don't really need to be that precise. If people are interested in finding out the details, they can then find out more information, of course. And we've also incorporated this little sentence that would have been stuck at the end, being a bit staccato, in the previous sentence. So just have it follow on from the previous idea. So that just gives you an idea of the kinds of things we would take into consideration when we're looking at a text like this, either to edit it or if we're translating it into another language. So finally, video. Again, similar principles will apply a lot of the time, but we have some specific things to subtitles, for subtitles. So as Ben mentioned earlier, the videos can be watched in a variety of different settings. So we need to think about what kind of circumstances viewers will be watching in. So we might have slightly more complex subtitles for a feature-length film that they'll watch at the cinema or at home on TV. But for something like an information video, we might opt for the simpler forms, because people might actually be watching those without sound or on the bus or on social media. So it's something that we need to think about. We want to split subtitles up logically and think about the units of meaning rather than just words. So for example, something like European Union, obviously together that forms a concept. It'd be easy for somebody to process if it's kept on the same line of the subtitle, and certainly in the same subtitle. If it's broken up, then viewers will read that as two separate words and have to really join the dots to realize what concept we're referring to. And here, as in any kind of translation, really, we are free to change the structure of the original or audio language in our subtitle if we feel that would be beneficial to the viewers in our language. So again, if we want to, we could change from a passive structure to an active structure, if that would be helpful. This only really goes for foreign language audio, because when we're subtitling audio in our own language, we will try to stick as close as possible to what people are saying, mostly in this case, so that the deaf and hard of hearing will have access to exactly the same information as a hearing viewer would. And here we just have a screenshot from the subtitling software that we use. This is from a video recorded by one of the European Parliament's vice presidents, Nicola Bear, talking about multilingualism at Parliament. This is a very basic example. It's not strictly the passive voice, but a more passive form in French that we've transformed into a more active form in English. It's just an example of one of the changes we might make. So that brings the first part of the presentation to a close. And now we'd like to suggest that you work on one of these texts and try and identify ways that you could improve it for recording. So this would be specifically an audio text. It's a piece of news. And we'd like you to just think, you don't have to write a new text necessarily, but think about the aspects that you would change, what things you think could be improved before it's recorded. So things like abbreviations, things like numbers that could be rounded off, things like complicated terminology and complicated syntax. So you'll be sent off into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes just to discuss this. And before we do that, I'll just copy and paste the whole text into the chat. So you can copy and paste it into a word processor of your choice.
Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good brainstorming session over this text. So we're just going to quickly go over your suggestions. We're going to try and take it sentence by sentence to try and have a bit of structure about it. So if anyone has any comments or suggestions about that first sentence, so the one that began last week, feel free to just post it in the chat. Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, active instead of passive.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion.
Yeah, that's a great one. So reach, so we're using the same verb that's there.
And spelling out EP, that's also a good idea because it's not a very common abbreviation in the same way that, say, EU is.
Great. Okay. Yeah, so, and any ideas for the second sentence? So the one that begins, the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund.
Yeah, I think that's really good to round out the number, for example. Lose the multi-annual bit. Yes, it's maybe a bit heavy. Exactly, cutting multi-annual framework, I think definitely would be a very good idea. These are excellent suggestions, thank you.
Okay, and how about for our third sentence, so the one that begins at Parliament's request?
This is a very long one, so but yeah, like the changing at Parliament's request to the Parliament requested that. Very good. Yeah, using money instead of fund. That's also a more everyday word.
Okay, and last but not least, our sentence 4. So that's the one that begins, negotiators also ensured. Any observations about that final sentence?
Again, yeah, we could use money instead of funds. It could be split as well, made into 2 shorter sentences. Yeah, that's true. We could just lose the negotiators also ensured entirely. There are lots of different possibilities, definitely. If anybody else would like to add anything, otherwise we could 2 instead of in order to. Yeah, that's a classic too. Excellent suggestions, thank you. So perhaps just to finish, as we're running a bit low on time, we'll just share with you a version that we prepared, which is by no means obviously the right version, but it's just something that was some suggestions that we would make probably if we had this text. So again, you can maybe read through the 2 versions, but I'll highlight the main changes that we would make. Some of you mentioned, I think, like changing passive to an active form. So having European Parliament came to an agreement with the Council instead of an agreement was reached. Spelling out EP and saying European Parliament because it's not such a widely known abbreviation, perhaps among the public. breaking down this budgetary priorities of EU asylum, migration and integration policies into asylum, migration, integration policy priorities. It's a slight reformulation, and we've also added that. We've added the reference to the budget afterwards instead. Also, somebody mentioned losing multi-annual financial framework, which is something that anyone who works within the EU would understand, but anyone outside the EU probably wouldn't. So we've actually broken this down into two different parts. EU budget when it's first mentioned, and then the years a bit later on. So that information is spread over two different bits. We've rounded off the number, of course. I think somebody mentioned that too. So we've got nearly 10 billion instead of 9.9 billion. We have this aim at enhancing solidarity and responsibility sharing. Solidarity is not a very everyday word in English, particularly. So instead, we've gone for encouraging EU countries to work together and share responsibility, which is it's an easier sentence to process than talking about responsibility sharing, which sounds a bit abstract. We've changed the reference to member states to EU countries. This really would depend very much on the language. I think in some languages, the equivalent term member states would be readily understood by most people in the public, but in English, it does sound a bit jargony. And which is why we would normally suggest trying to lose that and go with EU countries instead, which is a concept that most people would understand straight away. So again, I think we have a passive form here that we can change into an active form. So talking about local authorities receiving money instead of the funds being allocated. So we see the results more quickly. We've shortened in order to simply. This is also a bit unnecessarily wordy. We have this rather unidiomatic or even ungrammatical to support citizens to integrate, and simply change that to help people integrate. Okay, that's a more straightforward, much more straightforward way of saying it. And finally, we would think about changing their community to our community, especially because this would be directed to the public. So we'll be talking about all of our communities, and migrants be integrated into where we live as well. So it's a way of including the listener in what's being said. So that's really the end of the presentation. These are all the links that we mentioned earlier. You will receive the presentation afterwards, so don't worry about writing all these down, but you'll have links to all our social media pages and the different text and audio projects that we mentioned. And you've also got our email address here. So if you have any questions of anything, you think of anything afterwards, feel free to get in touch with us there. And now, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask us now.
Yes, thank you very much, Ben, Tom, and Bojana, for your presentation. It was very useful, very interesting. Also to see the clear language tips for different kinds of media. I would like to give the floor now to the audience. If you have any questions, you can also unmute yourself if you want, or write your questions also in the chat. I see that for Euro, you have usually our style guide tells us we should use Euro for the plural too. Okay, thank you very much for that.
For written text, that's definitely the case. We do sometimes for audio, products, we might sometimes say euros. That's more natural, I think, in British English to say out loud at least. It actually varies. Even I think in Ireland, euro is also used for the plural. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's the case.
Yeah, I think they commonly use, as we're supposed to in our written texts, both in spoken as well.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Uwe Dengler, if you want to come in.
Yes, maybe it sounds strange, but I have a question regarding these texts. When you simplify the text, why is it coming up in such a more bureaucratic form in the first place? Couldn't one just, try to write it a bit more understandable? Or is this just for the internal agencies? It has to be like this very bureaucratic form. just interested.
I think a lot of it's based on sort of raw information. So that's why we do a lot of adapting. So things that might be for internal consumption or information that's been collected by somebody else that we then have to adapt into a more reader-friendly or listener-friendly format. So that's really the case. But that's definitely a really good point, because it's something that we can also focus on more widely. And here we actually do have clear writing workshops as well for other members of staff, so they can also work on how they write reports and so on in the first place. So that's a very good point, because obviously the better the original, the raw material we have at the beginning, the better everything based on that will be. Thanks.
Any other question? If not, I would have also a question. I was wondering, how big is your team, your English team, and also in general the Directorate for Citizen Language?
So I think each language team in the Directorate of Citizens Language is formed of 4 people usually, provided all the posts are filled. But there are also language units in a different directorate, the Directorate of Translation, that are quite a bit bigger. So we're not the only ones working into our respective languages. But at the moment, each of the 24 languages has a team of 4, basically, at the moment.
Right, thank you very much. So it's a very small team.
Yeah, which has its own challenges.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, Liefke?
Yeah, hello. I am Liefke King from the DG Translation at the Commission in the German department. I would like to know, how much time do you have for your requests when these things come in? Are they usually something you need to do right away? Do you have a planning? Is there prioritization for videos or for podcasts, or can you plan yourself what you do first?
It really varies a lot, because it depends. We have these regular things. So, for example, the audio programs, the news programs, they're very easy to plan, because we know roughly when they'll be ready and when they need to be prepared for. If we have a special event, we might be preparing a podcast or a video for. Obviously, the event itself will be the deadline, so we can't really work around that. It really varies a lot. Sorry, that's not a very specific answer to give you, but it's true. It depends. Sometimes things will be very urgent, and sometimes we will have quite long deadlines for longer projects. Usually we have quite a bit of time to work with.
Would you also work on brochures, for example, then when it comes to longer text, or is that something that would go into the translation units?
I think it's more like I don't really know, because I don't think we've worked with brochures, at least since I've been here.
I can add something to that, maybe. We have had a few of those things come up for Europe Day, for example, and those were definitely longer texts, and we translated them and not the other directorate. And for the German team, I can say that usually the audio things have way tighter deadlines than subtitling and text. That's just what I can say from our language team.
Thanks, Brianna. Yeah, that matches, I think, our experience too in the English team.
Thanks.
I just see a comment from our yesterday's speaker, from Christina. It is always very exciting to see that the tips are basically cross-linguistic and lead to more comprehensible texts in all languages. Just a remark.
Yeah, I noticed too. Yeah, we noticed in Christine's presentation yesterday as well.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Right, I think there are no questions.
There is one in the chat. Are there also members of the directorate involved in the EU legislature, or if not, are there other language experts?
So if we're talking about legislative text, so things that would be involved in the legislative procedure, the language units would deal with them. Language units are quite a bit bigger as well. So they would deal with most legislative texts. We don't work with those. Our work is more directed towards communicating with the public.
All right, thank you very much. I think this was the last question. I would really like to thank you once again for your presentation and also for answering the questions. We are at the end of your part now. I would like to make a break now until Cheryl continues at 3:30. So we will make a 20 minutes break now.
Thank you so much. See you in a little while.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye,
Cheers.
thanks.
Bye. So welcome back after the break. I will directly hand over to Cheryl, who also got up very early today, early as yesterday. Thank you very much for that.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I'm looking for number 5. Okay. So this section is thinking on paper for the reader's process. I'll let you read what's on the screen. So these points are the ones I'm going to go into in a little bit of detail. And some of this we covered yesterday, and you can consider it a reminder of what you've already heard. So here we go. So the important thing to know is that the brain is always shooting information. It's constantly creating waves of information. Nothing is waiting for a stimulus. It's just always happening. The communication is constant between areas of the brain and neurons. So remember, we talked about inferences and what a reader thinks from reading what you've written. So when you see the old man in the boats, you expect that the man is the subject and you think there's a missing verb. This is the kind of sentence that causes people problems because it's the old is the subject and they man the boats, which nowadays for gender neutrality, we would say the old steer the boats, operate the boats, run the boats. But this is how we can confuse readers by, things just don't make sense. And that's why we need to review and have reviewers. We need a schema. So we give the reader a way. You don't have to read this in detail. It's just to show you that you have to have a plan in mind. And often that plan comes from thinking in advance and doing an outline or setting up keywords of what you're going to express. You can reduce the reader's effort by doing these items, and I'll let you read them. So if you have a question now, but we're going to go into these in some in more information. So this is the human thinking process. Please read it through. the last item is dispose of it, in case it's not showing up on your screen.
It's showing. Thank you.
Okay, I'll move on. So that sensory information is coming in from sound, sight, and understanding the word, the alphabet, the letters, the words. This diagram shows you the many strings of information that combine to give us good reading skills. And word identification is at the top. Vocabulary, how many words people know already, how many they understand, and what's easy for them. And then in terms of how they approach it, can we get their attention? Do they perceive it and understand it as we do? And are they going to be able to remember it, to use it? Please read. So the brain is going through all these steps to achieve an understanding of the sentence, but this happens instantaneously. So I asked the question, who should do the thinking work? And I say the writer should do that, because we can't count on our reader having the best reading skills or thinking patterns and figuring out what we mean. We have to figure it out for them. This is a chart of how the memory works. So at any point in the process, the mind, the brain, decides the information is not useful to us, or it's not understandable and we don't want to work on it, and it gets dropped, including from long-term memory. Things do get cleared out or compacted if they're not used regularly, and then it becomes harder to understand, to access them, to get to them. So here we go. And this is what's going on. So this last part is interesting, and we have to sort of speculate on what that means to us, but we're usually only recording the new information onto our old information. So sometimes episodes that happen separately may get combined in memory. And it may be hard to separate, what happened when, but we make an effort at that. So the schemas, again, what is a schema, and how might a reader incorporate something into one of the existing patterns? A schema is a pattern or a plan, I guess. So one that's common in English is Roy G. Beavy. It's a way to remember the colors. So that's a schema. It helps you retrieve that. It's easier to memorize this and then use it to figure out the letters that go. And the advantage of this is you only have to remember one bit of information, which will lead you to the 7 small and unrelated bits of information. So for the reader, we give headings, we use visuals, we do other things to show what's the scheme here. And then you can, remember that, and it helps you to access the more detailed information. So organizing information in a narrative or in a sequential pattern, step by step by step, helps readers. It helps them to remember, because if it's not delivered in a sort of chronological or logical order, there'll be problems putting it back together when the reader tries to retrieve it. They'll be going, what happened first? I can't remember. Again, you can ask me a question at any time, so don't hesitate. And if I'm going too fast, please let me know. Whoops. Let's see, how did we get to there? All right, so some things are not concrete, not practical, not specific. So how do we come up with a schema? Well, we can develop something that shows how the information flows, or what's important, what's not important, and use them. And these are visual metaphors that could be used. Again, inferences, it's the third and really most important part of reading, because it's the reader trying to understand. Okay. So I'll repeat, we don't want the reader to have to read between the lines or figure out what we're talking about. We have to say it specifically, clearly, expressly. And these are the international reading levels. I'll leave this up for a minute so you can read across and get a sense of it. So in terms of population in North America, or in the English-speaking countries, half the people exist at level 0, which is they can't read at all, or level 1 or 2. So half the reading population of the general public doesn't have very good reading skills. And the international bodies consider that level 3 is the minimum skill level needed to live in and manage in an information society. But people still need help making connections between different bits of information and identifying what's most important or significant to them. Level 4 is people for reading much better. Level 5 in any given country is only for 3, 4, 5% of the population that can read at the highest skill level. So usually now when the UN is reporting reading skill levels, they combine 4 and 5, and that's maybe a third of the population. So here we go. And again, to emphasize, level 1 and 2 are people who can't draw connecting lines between different bits of information. They need you to draw the line for them. Spatial relationships are means where you put something in relation to another piece of information. What's largest, or at the top of the page, or If it's secondary information, you might put it in a column, small column to the right. Spatial, that's what it means by where it is in space in relation to the other information. So this now, I don't intend for you to read, but it's the Organization of Economic and something Development, and their screening skill levels that they talk about. So, I'm missing the one that I wanted.
If I just may, Cheryl, we have a question in the chat from Uwe.
Yeah.
He would like to know, can you elaborate on implied inference? What do you exactly mean by this?
Okay, well, I'll bring back to mind the example I gave you yesterday, where the doctor gives you a prescription and says, take 2 pills 3 times a day. And then the reader has to think, how do I'm only up for 16 hours. How do I divide those pills into 3, segments? So do I do it at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or should I wait till bedtime? So the reader has to sort of figure out what's the best way. But instead of saying take 2 pills 3 times a day, a doctor can write or say, take 1 pill with breakfast, take 1 pill at lunch, take 1 pill with your afternoon coffee, take 1 pill at dinner, and 1 before bedtime. So there it's explicit. The reader doesn't have to do anything more than know when lunchtime is or bedtime. Does that make it clearer?
Yes, I think
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Yes, thank you. That was clear. Thank you, Cheryl.
So what I wanted to show, and I seem to have lost the slide, is that level 2 in this is 23% of the student population in the countries that were measured. So not everybody has those highest skills that you want them to have, and that's what I wanted to say there. So now I just want to take any further questions on the material I just gave you.
Are there any questions? If you want, you can also unmute yourself or turn on your cameras, or also write in the chat as you prefer.
Okay, well, let's pause that for a minute. We can come back. But will you share with us what I asked you yesterday to think about overnight, which is what are the 2 pieces of information that have most interest to you or significance for you in your work from what we covered yesterday? What do you recall as being significant? Type it in the chat.
Anyone, what do you remember from yesterday? What was very important for you? You don't have to be shy, you can unmute yourself, also write in the chat. I think there must be something you remember from yesterday.
Or something that left you confused.
Okay, we have a comment from Uwe. The necessity to be simple and clear in your communication style. Then from T. Knapp, use verbs instead of subjectifications and use visualizations. Anyone else? Or do you have any open questions from yesterday? Then from Francis, that visuals are more natural and quicker to process than words because all elements are processed simultaneously. Then from Antonia, the text should be predictable. There's a question from Claire. What happens to content that goes to the trash or the brain throws out? Is it gone for good? And if so, is memory retrieval a scam?
Well, well, the information that gets thrown in the garbage, it means it hasn't been processed, so it doesn't go into long-term memory. Or if it is transferred to working memory or long-term memory and then disposed of, it's gone. It is gone. But it's because it wasn't useful, it wasn't relevant, it didn't interest the reader, or they just couldn't understand it and they trash it. So that happens. And then retrieval of memory is regarding what is kept, and you have a lifetime of information and experiences that you have kept. I saw an interesting article this past week from a fellow who he played games, online games all the time. And he'd go to work and perform adequately, but then he'd go home and play the games again. And then people would talk to him, people he grew up with would say, remember that time we did this or we did that? And he'd say, no, I don't remember that at all. And what he tried, because he was concerned about this, that his memory was failing, is he stopped doing the games. He stopped playing online games all night and spent more time, clearing his head and being alert to what he was dealing with at work. And he found that his memory was accessible then. But before that, he had been taking in so much information data from those online games so quickly, he had overwhelmed his capacity to process and reflect and learn something from what he was doing. So the memory's there, but you have to be in a good, well-rested state of mind to get to the deepest memories. Okay, we're going to pause and go to the next subject. And we'll be looking at 3 very short videos because I think this fellow explains it, better than I do. So we're going to think now about the limits the reader suffers or lives under and figure out how we can do something better for them. Again, remembering that our goal is to facilitate the ease and speed of reading and the recall. So what is cognitive ease? And cognitive means thinking. What makes our thinking easy? One of those is the efficiency of it, is setting up relationships and cause and effect, timelines, whatever it is that connects the information, and following the reader's expectations of what's going to happen next. I'll show you later what to do when what happens next is not expected. Please read these. So this is what I mean about we want to improve these for the reader. That's our aim. We want to make their thinking easier. So we establish relationships and time orders and other things. And this is what I was asking you to read. So I'll emphasize that to think deeply, like to analyze and organize and do higher level thinking about something, you have to slow down and read the text at the speed of sight as you're seeing it, not skimming, scanning, etc. Okay, so we each have our individual limit to how much energy we have for decision making choices in a day. for example, myself, if I'm training some people in the evening, I make sure I don't do too much in the morning so that I have some thinking power left when I'm delivering later. My husband's the opposite. He gets up and does everything in the morning and then he collapses. So we have our different patterns and limits. If I can give you a common experience about cognitive drain and decision fatigue, it would be that, say you've worked all day, you've been very busy, you've been completely occupied with your work, and then you're meeting someone for dinner and they say, where shall we go? And you don't want to decide, you don't have any energy left. You don't have any decision-making power left. And you say, I don't know, I don't care, you decide. Well, what kind of food do you want to eat? I don't care, I told you I don't care. So we get cranky when we're depleted. And as I mentioned yesterday, you can, like with a Snickers bar ad, when your glucose is low, you can have something that gives you a little more energy, but it's not going to refill all that day's worth of energy. It's just going to get you through till bedtime. So the example here of the specific word is carnivorous. It's not a word you would want to use, but you move backwards from that to something more common that has the most information. But if you're speaking to university students who've studied biology recently, you could use the word carnivorous and they would probably be familiar with it. Other words that don't give you any specific information are like basis or usually or, medium, those kind of things. When you use a word like demise, the person has to figure it out. So this is, of course, usually used in legal matters, but it has so many meanings. It's going to take me effort to figure out, by reading the sentence and more information in the material, figure out which of these words it actually represents. So to make things more efficient, you want to start with the simpler, familiar word rather than the complicated word. This takes us to the systems thinking that Daniel Pink and others have put forward about how we prefer to operate on intuition, which is system 1. And that's where we have developed habits, patterns, muscle memory, and we rely on existing information to understand new information and we act on it. This is how people want to operate. The brain prefers this. If there's some schema, some pattern available from your previous experience, you will try to use that to solve a new problem or in a new situation. The problem with system 1 thinking is because it's something you've known forever and you don't think about, is it'll bring up the stereotypes that you believe in. Things will come from your subconscious, and it will, this is where our 100 biases come in, the psychological theory of biases. So we tend to like people who agree with us. We tend to stick to old beliefs and not want to consider new beliefs and all that. It's all of these things. So system 1 is okay when you only need to do superficial thinking. Like if you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you don't have to think about it. You just follow your standard habit. But system 2 thinking is when the question moves from the general brain forward into the areas of the brain that are always analyzing, categorizing, evaluating, doing the higher order thinking. So to move information there, that you've got to slow down. It operates more slowly, it takes more effort. You have to practice logic and trying to evaluate, etc. You calculate, and it's a conscious effort to understand something, to break it down and sort it out and know it. And we infrequently do this because we prefer to operate on automatic systems. So with reading, people will read, they'll skim and scan a web page, for example, and to use these fast methods. If you give them a book and say, read this, it'll be a quiz, then they're going to have to slow down and use system 2. Fluency is about, preferably, it's about people only having to use type 1 thinking and making it really easy for them to understand that by connecting with things they already know or correcting things they already know. Like if the thought they have is a bias or a stereotype that no longer exists or applies, then I have to say to them, you might have thought A, but the truth is B is the common thing. So you want to get people using those shortcuts to make positive judgments. So you want to structure things in positive terms rather than negative. And that's what requires only type 1 thinking. Let's pause and see if you have any questions about this cognitive load and cognitive cortical efficiency so far. All right, then. I'm moving on.
Oh, I have a question, sorry.
Okay.
I forgot to unmute. Is there a way to augment your cortical efficiency, or is this defined by your brain's biology?
Is there a way to augment your efficiency? Well, you become more efficient in an area that you deal in frequently. So expertise is having acquired a certain efficiency in approaching a particular situation. The way to become more efficient in general is to accept more challenges, do more different things, just expand your area of knowledge from, take up a new sport, a new hobby, something to keep your brain challenged and learning how to process information. I'll give you an example from a recent study. The researchers took 2 groups of experts. They took like cardiac specialists, medicine experts on the heart, and pulmonary specialists, doctors whose specialty was the lungs. And they combined mature experienced doctors with students. And then they gave the cardiac surgery group a problem to solve, and they gave the pulmonary students a problem to solve that related to lungs or the heart, whichever was their expertise. And the senior people would have a pattern. They would have established a way of thinking about the particular problem and sorting out what needed to be done. They had that, and the students did not have that yet and had to struggle or had to be told the system to use to solve that problem. And then the researchers took a lung problem and posed it to the heart surgeons, and they took a heart problem and they posed it to the lung experts. And neither the mature experts or the students had a clue where to begin to sort out a problem that concerned an organ that was not their specialty. They were beginners. So that's what I mean about, you come to know a certain area, and that makes you more efficient in that area because you have an established pattern, a schema, existing knowledge, and so on. So the only way to acquire new information and more experience and better analogies is to expose yourself to new things. Does that answer? Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes. It's
all right.
Very, very well. Thank you very much, Cheryl.
Sure. Okay, so you take in information from the environment and you surface process it very quickly. The sensory memory starts to put coding into it so that the working memory doesn't have to do all of that work. That's where your sensory memory comes in. So if you're paying attention, then it will appear in your working memory, and you might have 15 seconds. They sometimes say 33 words, or, there's different measurements that the scientists have taken when they had a different problem they were researching. but generally it's very short. So in the memory, you're trying to understand it, or make sure you can repeat it and clearly understand it, rehearse what it means to you, visualize it, so on. And then you send it to long-term memory, and then it can be recorded. And long-term memory is deep, and it's not a particular area of the brain, it's just all over the brain. It's just like one of our data disks, they just keep putting stuff around, and then once in a while you have to defrag your memory stick so that it organizes the information in a logical way, given the time and the effort. And here, for example, is multimedia. When it comes in, we're picking it up in what we hear and see, and we see pictures. So if we've got more things going on, we're getting a better understanding and moving it through working memory to save it, to attach it to prior knowledge. So then cognitive load has three parts. It's the extraneous, the delivery factors, and the split attention. So it's when a fireman's at a fire, they don't have time to read a manual. They've got things going on. The water's spurting, people are screaming, other people are yapping at them. So that's extraneous information that's creating a load. It's demanding attention or processing. Then in the material itself, let's say you've got a little card that has 3 items that you're supposed to do in a fire. Okay, you take a glance at that, and whatever's in that is the intrinsic load that comes with the material itself. Excuse me. And then the Germain load is how much of it is necessary to go into working memory to begin to process it. So whenever we're looking at something, we're saying, okay, what's the extraneous load? And let's see how much of that we can eliminate. So the cognitive load theory is that you get more intrinsic, the more complexity and effort that's required in the material itself, the worse effect the extraneous, the distractions are going to have on you, and your working memory gets overloaded. It can't process what to get rid of and what to keep. So you lose information. This was like the question someone asked earlier. Either the information is not processed or it gets dropped because something new has come in that seems more urgent. Iva Chen is a woman in Canada who has introduced the cognitive load theory to people on a broad basis and written about it. If you ever want to read what she's written, her name is IVA Cheng, C-H-E-N-G, and ivacheng.com, I think, is her site. So cognitive load is the total load it takes to it puts on your system, how much effort, energy, focus, etc. your working memory needs to work on that. The overload is when there's more than you can handle. So we want to write so that there's no overload. And the load is affected both by demand of the task, but also what resources you have available. So if you've already expended all your glucose energy for making decisions, it's just not worth reading the information because you're not going to be able to handle it. And then these are what distractions do. There's a 2-part message in this visual. And the first is that you can only handle so much at a time. But also that negatives are sticky. They stick in the memory. They clog the working memory. If you put something in the negative, a person has got to struggle with it. And if you give when you say something in a negative format in your sentence, the brain has to flip it over and express it to you in a positive frame and then say, but not in this time, not at this situation. It's like in the North American English, while back, teenagers would say something like, "Oh, I really like your hair." Not, you know, it was a put down to say a positive and then say, but not. That's exactly how the brain processes a negative piece of information. So that's why we want to use sentence structures that are positive. But there's some negative things you simply can't say in a positive way, you know. For that example, I might say, normally I would like the way your hair is done, but today I think it's a little off center, you know, something like that. Again, remember that the person, if they're not focusing on you, they've got other problems that are overloading them. Those are the videos. If we don't hear them today, we'll put them in the chat box so you can read them, but they review what I said today if you want to review it. So this is how we reduce cognitive load. I'll let you read it. Questions?
Maybe you could go into those points just so that our participants hear it a little bit.
Okay, so eliminate redundancy is don't repeat things. Now, I mentioned, and you often hear, tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. Well, you don't want to do that within one paragraph. You might do that within an article of 5 pages, but you don't need to repeat and repeat and repeat what you're saying in different words or in the same words. So redundancy is also stuff that's not relevant, not useful, doesn't have to be said, because that's a distraction. That takes up some energy. It requires thinking. If things are similar, we think, well, why are they both mentioned? What's different about them? Why did they both have to be mentioned? And then using visuals and written or spoken information, again, is giving people the information in different modes of sensory perception. And it's getting processed in all of those senses and moved to working memory. Extraneous information, again, it's information not necessary to explain what you're doing in the material. It's not central to the material. It's not relevant to the reader. And breaking it into chunks, that's a higher level thinking effort where you decide, well, these bits of information go together, they're harmonious, you know, or you actually write a topic sentence for that paragraph that explains an overview, and then the next sentences give detail. So everything's in manageable bits. And that's because it's a less strain on the reader to read small bits of information that belong together. Again, if the information that's related is spread too far apart, the inexperienced or low-skilled reader won't be able to connect those thoughts. If they fit together, put them together, and then you can detail or elaborate later. Physically connect related information. Okay, well, this list uses the bullets to physically connect. And I'll mention later, I'll mention now as well, that lists are something that the brain loves. Our brains look at this, it's organized to say all of these are equal. They go together in your memory. No one is a priority. Now, if they were a priority, if one was more important than the others, I would use numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I would order them so that the higher priority was in that way. So you're doing the selecting, organizing for the reader to help them process information easily. So for the reader, they care how it feels to deal with you, to read your information, and to try to use it. A heuristic is it's a pattern you've developed, a a tool that you're using that lays things out for your mind in a stepwise fashion, or connecting things that are connected. So we go from things that cause things to be easy to process and remember, to give us cognitive ease, which results in things feeling familiar, true, and good. And there was a study 10 years ago that's proven to be, it's been proven over and over again in later studies, that if something's easy to read, the reader will think well of the writer. They'll think the information is true and reliable, and they will feel good about the company or the agency that's communicating, and they will form a positive judgment. Now, that's just why misinformation is so easy to confuse you, because if it's familiar and clear and you've been primed for it, and you think you trust this writer or agency, then you're going to believe it. So people who are lying to you can be fluent, as can those who are telling you the truth. And one of the ways to make it easy to read is the font, a large font, a clear font, good colors, good color contrast, things that are like the green here. It's not on the bottom of the screen. It's not as easy to read as the others because of the pale green. So physical things also contribute to making it look easy to read and be easy to read.
We've got 4 videos in this little series on cognitive load theory. Watch them all to get a better understanding. Cognitive load theory tries to describe how the human mind processes new information. We have a very limited capacity for dealing with new information, anywhere from 3 to 7 elements. This is particularly tricky if the elements are interactive. Element interactivity means the degree to which the parts of knowledge have to be learnt together to make sense. For example, learning words in a foreign language has low interactivity. You can learn one at a time. Learning to drive has high interactivity because you need to process knowledge about changing gears, looking for traffic, maintaining road position all at once until some become automated. If a learning situation presents material in which we have to process too much at once, we experience cognitive overload. Cognitive overload impairs or prevents learning, so we as teachers need to avoid this condition in our students. We do this by designing instructional materials and activities that avoid exceeding our students' available capacity for working with new knowledge. Watch the next video to learn about the difference between long-term and working memory. Cognitive load theory proposes that while we have a very limited working memory, able to deal with only 3 to 7 elements at once, we have an effectively infinite long-term memory. Our limited processing capacity only applies to novel or new information, so the more that we have stored or automated in our infinite long-term memory, the easier tasks will feel. This is the feeling of competence or expertise. This makes sense. When we learn to read as children, we sound out words looking at each individual letter in very short words. Each letter is another element. As we start automating that process, meaning we hold the shape of words in our long-term memory, we read whole words, putting them together to create sentences. Eventually, we know so much about a topic that we can put sentences together to create conceptual meaning. Imagine 2 children learning about the food chain in the Serengeti. Child A has never been exposed to African animal names, whilst Child B has grown up hearing stories about African animals and can easily imagine each when named. They're in her long-term memory. While learning, Child A might become overwhelmed by the high interactivity of new knowledge presented in the food chain, given she's simultaneously trying to process the names of the new animals and their interactions. Child B already possesses a schema of knowledge about the animals, so only needs to concentrate on the interactions in the food chain, a much simpler task. Our job as teachers is to ensure that our students have enough long-term memory, or prior knowledge, so that whatever we're presenting does not exceed their working memory processing capacity. This is where pre-testing and spaced practice can help. Watch the next video to discover the 3 types of cognitive load and what we can do to optimize instruction. Cognitive load comes in 3 types: intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. These add up in order, meaning if the demands of the first 2 are too great, there's less room for germane load before cognitive overload occurs. The first type is intrinsic load. This refers to the innate difficulty of a task for a particular learner. This is determined by the number of novel elements and the level of interactivity between the elements. Given working memory is limited to somewhere between 3 and 7 novel elements interacting at one time, but long-term memory is unlimited, the more elements a learner holds in long-term memory schemas, the easier the learning task will be, because working memory is only limited when dealing with novel information. So a task will have a base level or intrinsic load affected by the complexity of the task, the expertise, and the working memory capacity of the learner. The second type is extraneous load. This is the additional load imposed by poorly designed instructional materials. Any unnecessary details included in instructional material, like funny cat memes or background music or unnecessary anecdotes or flashy but useless animations, causes some of the students' cognitive capacity to be spent dealing with that. If you use poor fonts, speak in a monotone, or use complicated vocabulary, this also imposes extraneous load. It's anything included that does not directly contribute to the learning goal. The third type is germane load, or generative load. This is the mental capacity that is directed towards integrating the new information with existing knowledge. This is what we aim to encourage. One way to think of it is that this is the part of your mind going, "Oh, I get it, that's like," and linking to some past knowledge when you learn something. If we overload the brain, we leave no room for these valuable thoughts to occur. We can also directly encourage such thoughts in our design by including prompts like, "Remember when we studied a similar idea last week?" So the aim of instructional design of any type is to manage how complicated a learning task is for our students, intrinsic load, reduce distracting material, extraneous load, and encourage germane load. Watch the next super short video to discover how learning is actually measured in cognitive load experiments.
Yes, so he was talking about, that was designed for people who, teachers. So that's why I'm not showing the fourth. It's not as relevant to what we do. But you can see again that understanding is learning and having information to use in future. So understanding is connecting our new information to an existing area of knowledge. I want to know if you have any questions. Any thoughts? Any concerns?
Richard, please.
Matthias or Thais, do you have a question? I don't think so. I think we can go on.
Okay, I do want to add one thing to what he said in that video regarding having, I think, did he say 5 to 7 items of information that you can hold? All right, so it's related to the reading levels as well. So as I said, people with the highest skills, level 5 of reading skills, are 3, 4, or 5% of the population. So 3, 4, or 5% of the population can hold 7 items in memory to work with, but the majority of us can hold between 3 and 5 items. And if you're writing for people with low reading skills, don't use more than 3 items. You take whatever list you have, you reconceptualize it and divide it so that the most related items are together and have an introduction that explains why they are relevant. So the 3 to 5 items is what you should remember about how many items you can put in a list to help your reader. All right, anything else? we'll go at what happened before this. We can't rely on algorithms. That's what's been used in the past. We have these brain sciences and the results that tell us what we can measure scientifically to determine whether something will be understandable. And we can also accommodate reader fluency. So readability. These are the old methods. This is when you had to do it by hand before there were computerized programs, before there were computers. You would count the number of words in a sentence or how many words were in a information, and you would come up with whether or not it had was easily read. But those were unscientific. They were based on some observations, but it's not crucial how many words in your sentence, as long as your sentence is structured in the default pattern and clear. And then these were the readability statistics. This was from Microsoft Word. And it would give you some readings. In terms of these, if you're dealing with them, having passive sentences under 30% is quite adequate. But these are not very good measures, and I can show you why later when we look at a passive sentence. And this is one of the latest ones that I did use. You have to subscribe and pay, but it gives you information, and you can consider whether your sentences are too long. If your average sentence is 35 words, you know you've got work to do. And and we'll go on. If these different levels used to be used to measure information. I mean, governments and agencies still like to use them because they'll hire a consultant to take something down to grade 7. And it doesn't matter if it's understandable or not, they just want to know that the numbers add up. So I don't use these anymore. I prefer to work on what guidelines I've developed from what the brain does. So again, that would be measuring whether something can be read with speed, efficiency, and can be recalled. And if the reader feels ease in reading it and does gain information. This was the reading process. And so words and sentence structure contribute to fluency, ease of reading, as does design and other factors. And accuracy of recall can be facilitated by using these tactics, which we'll go into later. And these will result in information gain, meaning information that can be recalled and used. So again, another version of this grade. We want to know the background knowledge, what the vocabulary is, what the language structures are, how the person reasons, and their literacy. And we want to facilitate the recognition of the word. These become automatic. These are strategic. We have to consider them and do that work, and make sure the reader can automatically appreciate the meaning. So this is what brings me to the brain. We're all human. We all have brains. We all have certain patterns that the writer can think of and rely on to make sure they're communicating best with the reader. So this is sort of the history. We used to look at readability formulas and guidelines and so on based on what was in the writing. And then we had experts come along and we started doing testing with sample readers, and we learn more, and we have to exercise our judgment in assessing the importance of these. And then reader focus was more focused on testing the readers to see if they had gained the knowledge. But now we can save ourselves some time and effort by thinking about the brain focus to begin with, produce something that's clear. And if it is tested in some way, then we've saved time and effort at that stage. But I have found in my work that most agencies and governments resist putting funding into a budget for testing with readers. So the formula for this is really quite simple. You understand readers and you want to help them, and you know how to make it easier for them to retain the information. The outcomes are speed, efficiency, and recall. Are there any questions about this information? Okay. That would seem to be
Yeah, short question, Cheryl.
Okay.
4%, that seems a lot for these geniuses. I mean, I don't know. I mean, where do these numbers come from?
Well, there was the testing of reading. They've also used and abandoned other aspects of knowledge in the past, because now they only repeat certain problem solving was a skill that was tested and measured for a while. So we have awareness of the different skills and what level people have. So what they found was that problem solving skills were generally related to the person's reading skill, and a person's ability to deal with numbers and arithmetic was generally lower than their reading skill. So we always want to make extra effort to present numbers in the most effective and efficient way. And that's a whole subject I can't get into today. But we know their problem solving skills are similar to their reading skill level. And that 4% is how many people have that reading skill level.
Ah, I see. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts? Share some.
Claire writes in the chat, genius IQ is generally defined as 130 or above.
Right. I repeated the use of the word genius from wherever it was the statistics were used, but I don't mean for that to distract you from the fact that there's a very, very small portion of the population that can read and problem solve at the highest level. You've used readability measures, yes or no? And is it more helpful to know how humans read and just accommodate that?
I think that some of you might use readability measures. Who wants to share?
I've never, I don't even really know what that is, so.
Okay, well,
I would need to know.
Yeah, what it is it's either measuring, the old-fashioned way of counting by hand, the number of nouns and verbs in a sentence, number of words in a sentence, or the computer mechanisms we use, the programs we use online to evaluate text and in terms of numerical formulas. And then.
Thank you.
I have many clients who, would set a reading level based on some information they had about general reading population or whatever. And generally it was a grade 6 or grade 7 level. But I finally convinced one client to put in the contract that it would be grade 7 or what the consultant determined to be readable.
No, it's very interesting because if you look at some social networks, on Instagram, for instance, there's a field, it's called bio, where you can give a short description of yourself or what you think is important. And this is 150 characters. So it's really very short, and I always find it very difficult to come up with something. And it's similar for some, when you apply for some jobs, you have some fields sometimes. And there you need to be very clear what you want to say and not. I think it goes in the same direction. But I haven't approached it that systematically, so that's very helpful, what you're saying.
Well, I think Twitter has had a major impact on how I write, because I think, how am I going to say this in, 200 letters or spaces? And, sometimes revise as I'm going, because you've got to fit that number. And one of the things I do, even in those small things, is use a heading, 1 or 2 word heading when I change topic. And that's tremendous in helping people move with you through a short bit of information and understand it more quickly.
Yeah, that's great, actually. But when I look, I deleted my Twitter account because it's this short format leads to people being very rude, right? They just insult others, and it's good as a newsreader, but not for discussion. I mean, this is horrible, I think.
Yeah, I rely on certain listservs where they're like, I follow a couple of groups of neuroscientists and reading instructors. I find the lists are useful. You get tidbits of factual information. Okay, this is trying to bring a lot of these ideas together and seeing what the consolidation is of this information. So I do have writability guidelines that I gave you as a handout earlier, and the point 1 is about using these pre-reading, prevising, other factors in capturing the reader's attention. So when we get then to the language and the grammar, there's all these things available, strictly grammar, strictly style issues, formalized style guides for different industries. Those are all unscientific, but if you're writing literary material, it matters. The ones about the brain, I've consolidated them into that 2-pager. And those headings show you the things you have to, pay attention to, and they're tasks for the writer. Now, these are some of the things that are supported by evidence. You want to use first or second person perspective, talk to the person directly or share, like, I've done this, what do you think we should do? Switching between first and second. Using active voice verbs, avoiding nouns made from verbs. Okay, there's evidence for these. And we must choose words that the reader will know, be familiar with. We need to use positive constructions and words as far as we can. And we need to organize the information in chunkable, easily readable segments that make sense. So the first thing was, how do we get them involved? And we covered this yesterday. So you use the traditional factors to get them to stop what they're doing and pay attention, or to stop and focus and try to push out all those distractions that they have coming their way. So what are the ways to make understanding easier for the reader? We're going to go to that. I'll let you read this. You've seen this at least once before, if not more. And that sums up what we have to know about the reader. Now, for example, there was an article written about the dodo bird, and it was in an exam that was set. So people who don't know about the dodo bird won't know where to begin with this. They could read all that information and still try to figure out, what's a dodo bird? Why haven't I never heard of it? So if your subject is one that people will never have heard of, you've got to introduce it. You've got to use analogies or metaphors to make it relevant in some way to your reader. All right, I asked you to discuss this yesterday in small groups. Can you, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the chat. Will you share anything that came up that's not on here, or would you please ask me to elaborate on any of these?
Does anyone have a question on this point?
Okay, I'm going to speak to each one. So the question,
sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. You say adults want to be active and self-directing. It's certainly true for some, but I sometimes have the impression people want to be, guided through the whole process, or are very lazy, or I don't know, yeah, they're not really proactive.
I'll tell you something that I was surprised to learn about people with low literacy. They will appear lazy and uninterested because they're afraid to engage, because they know their skills are not up to it, because of their past experiences. When they're dealing with a government or a government agency, social agency, they will be the same way, and yet they're there because they want information, or they're there reading that information. So it is true, and it comes from, pedagogy is about how children learn, and andragogy is about how adults learn. And it's true, adults do want to be active, and they want to have some control over what's happening and what they're being asked to do. Like you want autonomy, and in the workplace, you want to receive a task and be allowed to pursue it however you choose. So when people have low reading skills that are not up to the task, and they're embarrassed or humiliated by it, they will actually throw a fit. They'll come into somebody's office, talk to them, be told to read something or to fill out some form, and they'll stand up and throw the form or throw the pen or kick over the table and stomp out. And that's because that is some people's way of dealing with frustration and a feeling of inadequacy. So you'll get all kinds of behavior from people. That's because they don't understand. And they're afraid, even before you ask them to read, if you've got a form in front of you or something, and they're afraid you're going to ask them to read. So people have behaviors to cover up their poor reading skills. So I'm going to say question and answer format is only good because we've gotten used to it. We're quite used to it. And often you could say that, put the question in the person's, first person. So, second person, actually. You could say, how do I register for a fishing license? And then the information would be, you register by going to this website. You can do a question and answer format in first and second person. And that engages the person because it says, how could I do this? And they're thinking, how can I do this? The scenarios are examples that are extremely relevant, almost a perfect fit for this situation the reader's in, if you can do that. A checklist is handy because they check off as they make their progress through it, and they're engaged in it. They have to decide whether to check it off or not. And then you can do a quiz, like at the end of a document or something. You can say, so is it this or that, or is it yes or no to this, and so on. Now, I'll tell you a quiz I learned a great deal from, because I was told in some study that people hang on to the negative information, even if you correct it, if the first thing you hear is negative. So I was doing a test to measure the awareness of police officers about low literacy before I started even giving them information. I wanted to see what they knew already. So I gave a true and false quiz. And all of the questions were true, because I knew if I made a false statement in the quiz, that's what they were going to remember the next day, the falsity. So what we found out was many of them thought something that was false, something that was true was false. So I easily found out where they stood on the question, but I had not given them the wrong information. I had given them the correct information. So that sometimes is a factor. You don't want people to walk away, especially if you're just working to deliver awareness. You want to keep things positive or true and simple yeses. You could have an article and at the end say, ask questions and say yes or no, and as long as you tell them which one it is, eventually. Could be a way of summarizing something and then follow up with a short summary that explains what's true and false. Okay. And
Cheryl?
Yeah.
Could you maybe give another example of those scenarios that to convey information?
These? Okay, so it's about how do you get the person thinking and interacting. So if they're just clicking on a button, that's an interaction. You know, you can ask a question and say, click yes or no. You can ask a question and say, do you want to know more about this? And then something pops up and gives them more information. It's about just getting them involved in more than just sitting and visually looking. I guess I'm primarily thinking now about online ways to get them interactive. When it's just a flat print document, you can use a question and answer format, for example, pulls them in to say, is that the question I have or not? You know, and scenarios, especially if you can like use a visual to show a schema, a pattern, you know, that will help them understand the information and help them, they will engage to see how your information fits into that pattern. So that's it, you know. Would you like more on this? Please give me a question. Okay. So remember, this is about sentences. And we're facilitating the reading when we give thought to these things about sentences as we're editing or writing initially.
That was a bit fast, Cheryl. Could you just go back to the format slide and just, no, the syntax slide?
Oh, well, I've gone forward.
Because that was too fast for me, sorry.
All right, that's fine, yeah. So syntax is sentences, how things are put together and constructed in a sentence. And what the readers use to understand is the surrounding words that tell them what the particular word means in this particular time and place. They look at function to see, is it the actor or the action taken, function and position, noun or verb. They expect it to be subject, verb, object. And so the subject, if they see what they think is the subject, they expect the verb to follow, that kind of thing. And then, so sentence construction as a whole helps the reader. It's like a graphic representation to the reader of the meaning.
All right, thank you very much.
You can read these.
So there's another question in the chat. In your opinion, are these methods like checklist, Q&A, and etc. an important task for administration so that people are able to understand official documents better?
They are techniques that you can use to help people understand. And you know, probably supervisors won't understand why you've done that, but you can explain. This is, you know, there is to get the reader to really think about what your information is, not just to gloss over it, you know, scan it, skim it. You want them to stop and read it. So you do things to pull them in and make them pay attention and think.
Do you usually use those methods, or?
You know, it depends on how long the material is and what it's for. I don't use them all the time, but when it's when it will help, and you have to make a judgment. Sometimes you try it and see, try it on a neighbor in the office or somebody else and say, does this help or not? It is to a certain extent, you're guessing and predicting that it will help, and you might want to check with someone else. I always am asked about the scenario developed. So why time, action, space, cause, and intention? Okay, so the reason is we do have that sense of time that calls upon us to say, when is this happening? When did this happen in the past? When can I expect it to happen in the future? We have an innate sense of time, and it helps if we connect with that in explaining something. Space is, putting something in the reader's mind in terms of where it would happen to. When you go into a library, you are expected to be quiet. You help them, orient them to when this information is useful or applied. And describing the actions that have to be taken, explaining the reason is the cause, and giving intention is saying why, if you want to accomplish this, then these are the steps you have to take. What intention do you want or expect the reader to bring to the situation? Okay, so I went through this with you. And the sentences, this is on the handout. That's why I don't spend time on it. You can read it on the handout. Active voice instead of passive voice verbs, unless you can justify the passive voice. So active voice is what people expect. They expect to see action, something happening in a sentence. If the thing is happening to the subject, they have to get to the action and go back to the subject to figure out who it happened to. So that makes them go backwards instead of forwards. And as you know, our normal procedure is to predict and go forward. In some situations, you can justify using a passive voice because it's obvious who's doing something or who it happened to. It's polite, diplomatic to put something passively so you don't have to say who specifically did this. And yes, it's quite useful in legal information because you don't have to say, my client hit your car. You can say, when your car was hit, such and such proceeded to take place. I'll start from the bottom. Within a subject phrase, so your subject can be not just a name or a simple thing like the apple. It could be the person who wants to be effective, and then you use a verb. That is embedded information, who wants to be effective. So you might start with, to be effective, a person will, or if a person does this and that, they will be effective. Keep subjects and verbs close together. And when you're doing not a simple sentence, but a combination of two sentences together, which in English you make it's called a compound sentence. You add two separate sentences together, and so still you have to make sure the right verb is closest to the right subject. All right, that's just a repeat to drive this home. And when I say main noun appears before the main verb, if you have a secondary clause or a secondary sentence that is secondary in content and in relevance, you want to make sure your main actor and your main action are together and at the beginning of your sentence. These are the things you aim for. It's not always possible to do, or sometimes, like I find, my mind is blocked. I can't think of another way to express it. And I'll call upon an editor to help me make it work, because somebody else comes from a different perspective or experience and can help you. So in terms of sentences, this does matter. The sentence length matters because you've only got maybe 33 words in 15 seconds in working memory. And the person is not only remembering that sentence, they're working on it. They're analyzing it. They're attaching it to some category in their way of thinking about things. They're processing that sentence. So the number of words is not the most important factor. It's how much effort is it going to take for them to make sense out of that sentence. So complexity is relevant. And the deviating from the suspected order of subject and verb is also going to pose problems. Now, a theory or a concept, something abstract, can be the agent of the action. Sorry, I have to go back to that. All right. But so example, you can say freedom is such and such. Honesty is such and such. Thinking is a concept that's difficult. It doesn't have to be a person or a thing. It can be a theory or concept. We've seen this. You've seen this. This is about people's expectations. Again, don't make sure that you warn them what's coming. Right? Now, here's where there was no warning. So if a person you think is likely to skim or scan and not take the information seriously, but they're going to go through it quickly, throwing up a roadblock, causing some surprise, can stop them in their tracks and make them begin to pay attention. And that might be something you need. And then if you've got a really long message, you want to stop them and say, okay, again, now, why is this relevant to you? It's because you're trying to, or you intend to accomplish this or that. You can use a visual, you can ask a question, you can say, you might have thought, this and that, but you were wrong. Do you want to know what it really is? And something that stops them in the tracks. If they've just been skimming and scanning, it will stop them, be a bit of a surprise and say, uh-oh, I better pay attention. Things are not as I expected. And that's kind of a sophisticated technique, but one you could give a try. And then again, I always go back to this. I think it explains this so simply. When you say the old man, the boats, this is the visual image I get. But in fact, it means this. The older people are, in retirement and taking boat trips. So priming, previewing, primacy, recency, and continuity, all of those are explored in the handout, but I'm just going to speak generally of them now. Priming is telling people what's coming, using headings, using pictures, giving them, doing a summary at the beginning, giving them a preview, an overview. Primacy is establishing some order by the way you space out the information, by the colors that you use, by the size of the type, by a list and the numbers or bullets that you use with the list, and so on. Recency is the thing they last read, the thing that comes at the end. People will remember that. So if you need to reiterate some idea, do it there. If you need them to take action, tell them what the action is at the end of the document. And continuity is pulling it all together, making it all fit together so the person doesn't have to wonder, what's that got to do with what I just read in the other sentence or paragraph, Maintaining some thread that makes it obvious to people. And that can be keywords or signal words like first, second, third, and so on. Another way to make things memorable is to provoke emotion, use contrasts between what they think is and what really is, or to create a mental image, tell a story that creates an image. I can't read the bottom one, I hope you can. Simplify or exaggerate to make a point. Quote other people to say, this is how it is now. And this was said by William Zinsser 50 years ago. or tell stories. Give them some facts and then lay it out in a story. That will help people remember in order to use that information to accomplish their task, which is what the plain language definition says. Any questions so far or about this?
Yes, if you exaggerate, doesn't this kind of compromise your message or make you look, not or lacking integrity?
Well, exaggerating, you have to balance that or contrast that with the reality. So you're saying this is really big and you put up a picture of the universe, but you say, but not that big. This is like learning your solar system, they remember the comparison, that thing is not as big as a solar system, not as big as a universe. I don't think I've ever used that, but it's considered to be a way to make something stick.
Yeah, definitely. Sometimes I fall in the same trap, I exaggerate, but that makes my points look weak somehow, because people say, oh my God, this guy is exaggerating all the time.
Oh yeah, well, you say, that's an exaggeration, but here's what's really going on, You have to explain right away, and the exaggeration is just to twig some thought, like they might think, oh, that's an exaggeration. And you say, yes, it is. This is how it actually is. Not what you expect or what you've encountered before, but this is what's actually happening now.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay, the other way to provide some structure is this, to have your different size headings. You never want to have more than 3 levels of headings, because people lose track of, what was the main heading on this? What's this about? I've already forgotten what we're talking about. So don't go more than 3 levels deep. Again, layout helps people read, helps them, because a lot of times we go back to look at something to remind ourselves or to something we've forgotten. And so those headings help us use the piece of information as a resource item. We go back to a particular question or issue. Continuity you accomplish through these techniques. Okay, moving on.
Perhaps you would like to explain a bit? Or just mention a few points on the slide?
Well, okay, usually in a paragraph, the style advice is to have a topic sentence that explains the topic. So doing that tells people how the other information is connected in that way. It's more detail on that topic. You can use keywords, keep repeating that this conversation is about neuroscience by continually repeating neuroscience, neurobiology, neuro this, neuro that. Or at the end, you summarize what you've just explained and then suggest how it will connect to the next chunk of information. Obvious or familiar schema or organization. So a lot of people are using comic book style nowadays to try to express things, or they're putting not just a presentation, but a document onto a PowerPoint slideshow. So you're accustomed to going through one chunk at a time on a slide, using something that people are familiar with to help them see where you're going, where things are going. And positive information, you always want to come first to create that positive structure of information. And then you can say when it doesn't apply, what the limitations are on that, or you can get sophisticated and say, you want to do this, not that, but you can do that when something else is happening. You play around with that. And this is the connections. So when you're using a keyword, or you're connecting and comparing, or you're giving keywords, advanced organizers or structural elements like a set of headings or numbers or anything that takes a person through your document. And if you show cause and effect consequences, people are looking, their brains are going to long-term memory saying, where have I seen this keyword? What's it connected to? They're using these things to keep everything organized that's related and connected to what they already have. I showed you originally that neuron that's searching around for a connection, you know, and you want to help it make that connection. And the way to do that sometimes is to link new information to what they already know, or to start with what they know and then give them the new. It's in terms of a paragraph, it's been suggested that you could start with what they know and then introduce something new at the end of the paragraph, because that will probably stick in the memory longer, better. And these we've talked about. So let's talk about passive to active for a moment. Paraprofessionals were hired from within the community. That's kind of bureaucratic sounding language. And in this instance, it was a adult support group for a school that was being explained. So what you wanted to say was, you know, this is from real people, this is from the school board, and we hired paraprofessionals from the community. So, you know, it tells them this is actually, these people are going to know your situation and want to help you. It's just friendlier, more inviting, and easier to understand. And there's no reason not to do it this way. Or you could say, we sought out paraprofessionals from the community. I'm not saying that any one way to write something is the only way, but it's what the intent of this rewrite is to make it noun subject verb action and whatever want to add after. So I've gone over and over this. Again, this is on your handout. You want to use core verbs instead of making nouns out of verbs, like talk about something was considered rather than consideration was given. You put your subject and verb together. And at average, if it's for the general public, you want to have 20 words or less in your sentences. If that's a problem, you break your sentence out into a list of phrases, or you make a numbered list of the important factors that you want or trying to put into one list or one sentence. Chunk and label, this is the higher thinking activity that the writer needs to do to make things easier for the reader. You want to use those headings and subheadings as signals. I don't find myself often using the signal words like first, second, and next, and finally. I don't often say and now, and then, and later in writing, but I tend to rely on heading and subheadings because what I'm writing is usually very sparse information that you want people to get the gist of it and be able to do something with it. But this tactic helps with anything that you're writing.
Cheryl, there is another question in the chat. How do you define or, as a writer, select necessary information? Isn't this a subjective choice and different depending on the individual reader?
No, because what you, the writer, are doing is you're thinking about that reader and what do they care about and what do they need to know, and you give them that, and not other information you think is very, I have this, you know, I have to struggle with this. Oh, that's interesting. I really want to share that. But my reader or my learner doesn't need that information right now in this stage of explaining the situation. So it's not subjective, but it's you're evaluating what the reader needs and what they don't need right now. Okay, and I did want to remind you 3 to 5 items in a list. a list can be a sentence, it can be a phrase, it can be one item. So you want to follow proper grammar within your item. Now this is an example of something that's not going to be easy to read. What on earth, and how much of this is absolutely necessary? You know, going inside, you don't want people to take their scooters in. How many people bring their scooters in? I mean, how often do you have to say that to somebody? Do you get what I mean? This is just an overload of information. And whoops. And that's the end of that one. So and we were talking about bearing in mind how the reader wants the information, and that's what I was covering now. So is there anything more I can go on about? Our next subject is to review those guidelines for writing, and I can go right on to that if you like.
Anyone have a question first? Otherwise, we would continue now. Or perhaps would you like to have a short break before we continue, or would you like to continue, maybe finish a little bit earlier?
Yeah, I have just a short addition to my question about the selection of the information. I mean, I understand what Cheryl said, that you have to decide, you know, the message you want to convey. But on the other hand, you cannot guarantee that it's received in the way that you want, or that the reader understands what you really want to say. I don't know if this is too complex or too complicated. But
well,
isn't there a need that you need to adapt somehow to the, you know, reader, to his mindset or his long-term memory, or I don't know. I mean, if he has a different long-term memory like yours, he might completely understand it not so easy, right? And because
that's the problem. Like in the example I gave you of an assignment for student editors as to revising a brochure about buying a child seat for the car. I did have one student who complained because she spoke to me and she said, how can I have empathy? How can I put myself in the shoes of that person, that parent buying a child seat? That is not part of my life experience. Well, my answer was, it has to be part of your experience as an editor or a writer to try to do your best, not to feel what the reader feels or maybe to have their exact perspective, but to imagine, what are they thinking in this situation? What was I thinking in a similar situation? What's analogous to their situation? So I want to understand how they're thinking about this purchase. What's more important to them? Well, I think it would be safety, or would it be comfort for the baby, or what would it be? So it's a matter, yes, of imagining how the reader sees this and what they need to know, what steps they need to take, what order do they need to take them in, and so on. So you have to try to relate to the reader. You don't have to feel what they feel. You don't have to have had the same life experience, maybe an analogous or a similar experience in some other way, and you can identify with the emotion or concern that they're feeling. So it means, in plain language, you've got to think about the reader from beginning to end. And that's your guide always. You know, what's the reader thinking? What do I have? What fears do they have? What fears do I have to clear up for them? You know, how can I dispose of those fears so they can get on to the task? It's trying to be a human, understanding a human. And it's a challenge. It's a bit of work to go outside your own life experience and picture how somebody else is living and what they've been through. And you can't know it exactly, but you might be able to know what result it would have on them.
Yeah, that's Thank you. That's very helpful. Because I had the experience that, when I tried to do this, I wasn't always on the right track. That means I thought I had understood the experience of the other, but then they told me, oh my God, you're completely off.
Yeah, well, you can do a search on Google for personas, persona, and in Wikipedia, they talk about persona, and it's an idea, or a chart was devised by someone named Dave Gray, G-R-A-Y. And it allows you to stop and use a chart to say, okay, what do I think they're feeling? What do I think their fears are? What do I think the challenges are that are interfering? You know, it's got 4 or more fields where you stop and think, you know, and that helps you dreads things up from your memory. It asks you the questions to think about, to have a better sense of what your reader wants to know. And sometimes those are called empathy maps. How will they be feeling? A persona often includes some demographic information, what you know about their age and marital status and where they live, et cetera, but also then how are they likely to be operating or thinking in this situation that they're in? I mean, one of the first questions when I get a writing assignment, I usually go back and ask what seem like stupid questions. Why are they doing this? And, you know, what's causing them to do this? When in life would they do this? When will they, you know, how does it work? Where can they get more information? Just, you know, get information to try to see things from their point of view. And that's a frustration I've had, you know, for 30 years, is that people will say, oh, it's just the general public. We want everybody to know this. Well, that's why you have to go off and think, okay, what's bothering the general public? Okay, COVID, loneliness, isolation, you know, lack of work or fear of going back to work at enough, all these things, you know, right now, if you're reading current events, you know something about how people are functioning right now, what they're thinking and feeling. So you know that, or as I said, I have an article for North America that tells us how many people are depressed, you know, which makes it harder to think and figure things out, you know, what their moods are, what their issues are, what their limitations and disabilities are. All right, so the ISO is the International Standards Organization. And it's a volunteer organization. They have branches for the air industry and the shipping industry and the transportation and trucking. And so this is where the industry professionals get together and they come up with guidance and, you know, standard operating procedures, et cetera. So, and then the individual organizations, they actually have to buy this thing. They have to buy the standard. It's usually $200 to $300 for us here. So the plain language working group were in contact with this organization and asked them if they could develop a plain language standard. And so it's been probably 10 years they've been working on deciding how to provide general guidance to people, what the big issues are, and how to make this apply across languages. So I'm just going to quickly go through that for you, and then we can talk about when this comes into effect, is your agency likely to adopt these, and how would you comply? So the plain language movement was seeking to have more credibility. The industries will be seeking to comply with what is the standard of behavior, you know, or the standard of the good effort they have to make in any situation. It comes out in 3 parts. These are the 3 parts. So it's not a law. Like in the US, they have a law that requires that government agencies communicate in plain language, and they provide some guidance on what that is. This will not be a law. It will become industrial practice. So first thing they say is guidance on a higher level concern is sequence. Make sure that you're sequencing information. So we have discussed that in terms of the brain's function, and you see the value of having sequences. Later parts will deal with particular languages and certain industries and so on. These are what the higher level concerns are that will be in the guidance document. So is there any one of these that you would like me to elaborate upon? For an organization to show that they have complied with the ISO standards, they will have to show that they gave consideration to each of these factors. Those are the high level matters, and those will apply in any language. Whatever language you're writing in, you can do those things, okay? When would they have to prove? Well, what happens now is you, in whatever industry, there's a lawsuit or there's a complaint to the Industrial Regulatory Association. And the agency that wrote the material will have to say, well, we employed a writer who was trained in these techniques and they did this. And, somehow we hired an expert who was trained in this and assured us that we had addressed these situations. Now, it will come up when someone calls an organization to task one way or another. So the part one and what will be adopted, it's not yet adopted. It's expected by the fall of this year, it will be released. It's been reviewed by people speaking more than 17 languages. And then the later parts of the standard will focus on a particular language and give guidance in that particular language of how to deal with things. So the International Plain Language Federation is the umbrella body, and the members of it are the Plain Language Association International, the Clarity, the Legal Plain Language Society, and the one in the States, the Center for Plain Language. They are all the members of the Plain Language Federation, leading the work for all those separate organizations and others. And they are asking that people contact them and help them work out what the standard should be in a particular language when it is released at a later date. What will it mean for you? I think that might be the last slide. Yeah, next to this last. So what will it mean for you? Is your agency likely to be one that would be having to apply a standard like this that might be called to account or not? How will having to go through that list of 8 questions in planning a document, how will that affect your current working process? Pretend I'm not here, you're not asking a question, you're talking to the other people. Share with one another what problems this might pose for you or how this would be beneficial to you.
Maybe you would like to show those standards again. Maybe it's easier then.
Sure. That's me. That's how I'm saying goodbye. Okay. It's not rocket science.
Would someone like to come in here?
Well, it means, or it could help making things better to grasp across a big organization. You know, in your local environment, things might be clear, but different groups use different types of communication or different styles. So maybe this is, but on the other hand, it's quite some effort to fulfill all these requirements. I know some people who work in the area. That's really very special.
Well, these, in the main, you could say that these are part of the concept theory practice of rhetoric. These are rhetorical process of working through each of these questions to come up with the appropriate message and wording. So people who studied, English language, composition, etc., who have that background before they become communicators, will have an awareness of these and maybe have to refresh their memory on what it means, and how to do it. But like I come from law, so for me, it was a whole new thing to start figuring out how do we approach these things and what do they mean and what tools are available.
Perhaps it's also a little bit difficult for a few participants because they're not really clear writing practitioners. Maybe therefore they can't really tell. Exactly.
Yeah, okay, so, well, I would say then it's probably not going to have an effect on you in your work, but it will have some effect on the editors and plain language practitioners, or set a standard for them to follow. Well, at least you have an awareness of this, and when people start arguing about it later this year, whether they have to pay attention to it or not, whether it applies or affects, you'll have some thoughts that you've reached, and you'll be able to contribute to that conversation. Okay, so and that's it. So any more discussion you have, any thing more you wish to know? Was there something you were expecting to hear from me that you haven't heard me discuss? What are your expectations that have not been met? I'll hold this against you.
Does anyone would like to give some feedback? Or are there any questions that haven't been answered so far?
No, not for me, but I can say I didn't know what to expect because, it's not my area, but I'm very happy. It was very helpful, really. It's great. Thank you.
I find I'm using this information with my grandchildren. I'm saying, I know why you think that, but this is what's wrong with your thinking. And I think it has made me more understanding of people and our different perceptions of what's going on.
There is a question in the chat from Claire. How relevant is readability in the era when people read half of a heading and then immediately share outraged rants without even reading the article that follows?
Well, it's relevant when that's important information that they need in their daily lives. They have to make decisions. It's not relevant when you're writing literary information or academic information. You want it to be clear and understandable, but you can exhibit some style in writing or more of your personal perspective and voice. But when you're writing information that people need to accomplish a task, which is usually what we're doing when they're getting warnings or information or data from a government, a social agency, anything, workplace like that, then they're going to read it or suffer the consequences. And yeah, Twitter it's bad effect. It's a bad social effect. look how people have reacted during COVID. Instead of being understanding of one another, they're just putting themselves to the fore. And the communication by various governments were really bad. The Plain organization had a workshop with someone from Europe talking about, I think it was from Ireland, showing the communication materials they put out about COVID and explaining how they were not understood, they were misunderstood, they were ill thought out, you know. And so it was really a very concrete situation we were all in, and we could see how different governments dealt with it and what worked and what didn't. What can government learn from clickbait? Well, you can learn the questions, you know. Do you know 10 things about how much your customers know on this or that? They ask you numbers, you know, here are 5 things. Do you know why this? It's questions. That's what clickbait always pulls you in with the question, or appeals to your sense of social status and says, be the first to know. You know, don't lag behind your classmates. Do this. So, you know, it's marketing language. And, you know, plain language really didn't. And the issue of being more clear in communications came from marketing language, marketing departments who were already doing research to see what do people want to buy? How are they going to use this? How can we promote it? How can we sell it? So those techniques have been drawn into communication to see how do we best communicate. But we've moved beyond marketing impetus and techniques and been developing our own user experience techniques and user comprehension techniques and so on.
We also have
the headline that draws you in. I do that all the time. And even if it's like a slideshow with images, what a celebrity looked like 20 years ago and what they look like today, they never have the one that's in the ad for that material, you know, in the promotion, or it's so far down, I never get to it, I give up. I'm intrigued by a question and I click on it and go through it, and then I get frustrated. It's not sloppy, it's just a way of pulling you in, because they never answer the question that you think is going to be answered, and that's your intention for being there. But they give you all this other stuff while they're throwing advertising at you on the side. It's a technique. Yeah, most of you won't read this means, you know, you're a bunch of idiots, but out there, but you probably want to know this because you're not an idiot. Yeah. Appealing to pride and self-image and status, these will bring people in to read something. You could say that marketing has gone one direction of making things more difficult and going into misinformation, all of that, while the good parts of it have been retained in trying to clear communication.
All right, thank you very much. Does anyone have another question? Otherwise, I would say we're at the end of day 2 now, at the end of our workshop. I would like to thank you very much, Cheryl, for your contributions, for your workshop, and also for everything you showed us. It was very interesting, also very useful. And as said, we will send you all the material in 1 or 2 weeks, including the recording link. And in this email, you will also find a short anonymous survey. We would be very happy if you filled it in, just because it really helps us to improve our workshops. So yeah, you will get this email in 1 or 2 weeks then with everything. Yeah, and then thank you very much again. I see Tom is also here. Also, thanks Tom again for your contribution. Ben has already left. But also thanks to you both. And yeah, then have a lovely evening and take care.
thanks from me too. And if you have any questions, like in the next couple of days, I'm sure you can contact Cheryl directly or also Manuela and me. So.
And please do feel free to contact me with questions, because you help me understand it better when I have to explain it. And the best way to learn, they say, is to teach somebody else what you know and figure out what you don't know in the process. So I look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, and thank
Bye.
you very much. And then have a nice evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
You too. Bye bye. Nice evening.